Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving right into one of the absolute most dramatic, mind-boggling turning points in modern history, the end of World War I. Think about it. For 4 long years, the Western Front barely moved an inch. It was just brutal gridlock. And then, suddenly, in 1918, the Central Powers experienced this rapid, almost unimaginable collapse. We're going to break down exactly how the Allies actually pulled this off, how Germany totally imploded from the inside out, and the truly monumental human cost of those final, frantic days.
So here's the big question we really need to answer today. How on earth did a grueling 4-year stalemate just collapse in a mere 100 days? There's this super common myth floating around that World War I just sort of, fizzled out because everyone got tired and went home. But man, that couldn't be further from the truth. The final year of the war was incredibly dynamic. We're talking about some of the largest, fastest, and most lethal campaigns of the entire conflict. The momentum shift in 1918 was simply incredible to witness. Okay, let's move into Section 1, Germany's last gamble fails, the Spring Offensive.
To really understand the end, we've got to start with Germany's absolute last desperate roll of the dice. Early in 1918, with the Russian Empire surrendered and totally out of the picture, Germany rushed troops all the way from the Eastern Front over to the West. The goal? Pretty simple but incredibly risky. Launch one massive final push to win the whole war before fresh American troops could arrive in Europe. They called it the Kaiserschlacht, or the Spring Offensive, and it was staggering. Using these brand new stormtrooper infantry units trained in infiltration tactics, the German army burst forward 60 kilometers. Literally, in just a couple of weeks, they grabbed territory that France and Britain had spent years bleeding over. But as you can guess, it came at a completely devastating cost. Between March and July, we're looking at over 1.5 million total casualties across both sides, just an astronomical number. So let's dive into this. How exactly did a massive tactical success morph into a complete strategic disaster? Well, for one, the German troops advanced so insanely fast, they actually outran their own horse-drawn supply lines. Plus, those troops they pulled from the Eastern Front, they were totally exhausted and just not trained for the meat grinder of Western trench warfare. Throw in a horrific wave of the deadly Spanish influenza and the loss of their absolute best, most experienced frontline soldiers, and the offensive just hit a brick wall. It ran out of steam. Meanwhile, the Allies got smart. They finally unified their command under French General Ferdinand Foch and managed to plug the gaps just in the nick of time.
Which brings us to Section 2, the 100 Days Offensive. The Allies strike back.
With the German army totally exhausted and stretched way too thin, the momentum shifted, and I mean violently. Unlike that German Spring Offensive, which really just relied on overwhelming localized force that eventually fizzled, General Foch brought in what we'd now call modern operational art. The Allies didn't just smash into one spot. They delivered these highly coordinated, successive blows rippling all up and down the entire Western Front. By utilizing advanced tanks, thousands of fresh American troops, and a totally unified command structure, they relentlessly hammered the German defensive networks. They literally never gave them a single second to breathe, recover, or send in reinforcements. And the real breaking point? It happened right here on August 8th, 1918, when the Allies launched a massive surprise attack at Amiens. It was such a shattering, devastating blow that the German commander Erich Ludendorff famously called it the Black Day of the German army. I mean, the Allies scooped up over 25,000 prisoners and seized massive amounts of ground almost instantly. The psychological impact of this was just immense. It was the exact moment the German high command realized, wow, we are no longer calling the shots. The Allies were now completely in the driver's seat, dictating the entire pace of the war. But, military defeats on the battlefield were really only half the story. Let's head to Section 3, Collapse on the Home Front, the pressure cooker. This brilliantly illustrates what was happening behind the lines. Imagine your entire country just running out of food, running out of coal. The British naval blockade was absolutely devastating, causing severe rationing and, quite frankly, mass starvation among ordinary German civilians. On top of that, essential raw materials like iron and steel were drying up because there just wasn't enough skilled labor or fuel left to mine and transport them. You combine that kind of desperation with crippling inflation, massive war debt, and a public that is just completely, utterly sick of fighting, and the whole situation boils over. You get mass strikes with citizens demanding immediate political reform. It was multiple simultaneous crises just completely breaking the back of the German state.
So let's look at Section 4, Abdication and the Armistice, the dominoes fall. realizing the war was completely lost and a domestic revolution was right on their doorstep, the military dictators of Germany, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, pulled a wildly cynical, calculated political maneuver. They suddenly convinced the Kaiser to create a civilian government, essentially just to take the fall for the impending defeat. And man, the dominoes fell incredibly fast. In late October, the German Naval Command ordered this suicidal final attack against the British fleet. But the sailors at Kiel, they knew the war was over. They outright refused to fight and mutinied. This refusal sparked a wildfire of protests and strikes across the entire country. Things spiraled so out of control that by November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II just threw his hands up, abdicated, and fled to the Netherlands. A republic was proclaimed, and literally just 2 days later, that brand new civilian leadership signed the armistice. Now, it is absolutely crucial that we define what actually happened on November 11th. An armistice is a ceasefire. It's an agreement to stop shooting. It is not a formal peace treaty. But make no mistake, the terms imposed on Germany here were undeniably severe. They had to immediately evacuate all occupied territories, hand over massive amounts of heavy military equipment, and totally surrender their warships. These conditions were very specifically designed by the Allies to make it physically and logistically impossible for Germany to ever restart the war. Which brings us to a really somber reality in Section 5, the immense human cost, a staggering toll. Now, what's really important to take away from this is the sheer, brutal scale of destruction, which is almost impossible to wrap your head around. We're looking at millions killed, injured, or missing across nations like Russia, France, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. And it wasn't just the frontline soldiers either. These numbers reflect an entire generation utterly decimated by the horrors of industrialized warfare. Breaking it down further, just look at this. We're talking about 9.44 million total military deaths for the entire war. That's 5.4 million for the Allies and 4 million for the Central Powers. And keep in mind, those figures include battle deaths, poison gas casualties, disease, and soldiers who died in captivity. It's just a completely unprecedented loss of human life in such a compressed time frame. And to really put the sheer ferocity of 1918 into perspective, check out this number. 1,855,369. That is the staggering number of casualties suffered by both sides combined during just the 100 Days offensive alone. The fighting absolutely did not slow down at the end. If anything, it reached its absolute bloodiest crescendo right up until the very minute that armistice was signed. So, the guns finally fell silent, but the world was forever changed. Section 6, the fall of empires, a redrawn world. While the war was effectively over, the geopolitical map of the world was permanently fractured. 4 massive, centuries-old empires completely disintegrated as a direct result of this conflict and the ensuing revolutions. The Romanov dynasty in Russia, they'd already fallen to revolution back in 1917. The sprawling Habsburg monarchy of Austria-Hungary completely broke apart into multiple independent nation-states. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and, as we just saw, the Hohenzollern dynasty in Germany was wiped out and replaced by a republic. The entire global order was completely, fundamentally reconfigured. The formal peace was eventually handed down at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, resulting most notably in the Treaty of Versailles. And I say handed down because it was entirely dictated by the victorious powers. They stripped Germany of 13% of its territory, took away all of its overseas colonies, and severely restricted its military capacity. Remember that calculated political maneuver we talked about earlier? Well, it was the newly formed civilian government that was forced to sign this incredibly unpopular treaty, not the military high command who had actually started and lost the war. But honestly, perhaps the most damaging part of the entire treaty was Article 231, which is often called the War Guilt Clause. This essentially held Germany completely legally responsible for causing the war and all the immense damage it produced, which then served as the justification for crushing financial reparations. Unsurprisingly, this deeply humiliated the German public. And because the fighting actually ended before Allied troops ever crossed onto German soil, this really dangerous myth began spreading among the public that their army hadn't actually been defeated in the field, but instead was stabbed in the back and betrayed by politicians at home. Which leaves us with a really profound question to consider today. Did the abrupt, sudden nature of the armistice, combined with the crushing economic and psychological weight of the Treaty of Versailles, actually secure peace? Or did it merely plant these toxic seeds of resentment and instability, seeds that extremist movements would exploit to plunge the world into an even more devastating conflict just 2 decades later? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.